Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to MRC Online. I'm hoping that you're having a good summer so far. I am really excited for our opportunity to kind of move into what we're moving into today. We're actually going to make it into the Promised Land today, which is pretty big stuff after 5 weeks of studying and wandering around the wilderness with these children of Israel. And I'm excited to get into this with you for a couple of reasons, because we're going to jump into a pretty cool story. We're going to see two battles in two towns, and in all of it, I think we're going to see what can happen when we kind of get out ahead of what God's up to. So I'm excited to jump into this with you. If you've been with us over the last few weeks, you know that we're in this series called Old School. And what we're doing is really trying to walk through the Old Testament. And we have spent a lot of time with the children of Israel and Moses out in the wilderness, because we're seeing it. And I love the way Ken has really worded it for us, that their story really is our story. And there's so much for us to learn from and take from these different opportunities to see what they're up to and what they're into. We've seen Moses on the front end, right? And how underqualified and insecure he was about being the one to go and lead this big charge for freedom. You know, we've seen just how poorly the children of Israel have responded time and time and time again as they've wandered around the wilderness. We've seen just how hard it is to keep a God focus in the middle of the journey that they're in, as they're looking at God in amazing and tangible ways, as they're having food just dropped out of the sky for them to eat, as they look at the pillar of fire and the cloud during the day. They still struggle to stay focused on God. And I think that should tell us something about our lives too. Make no mistake about it, the story of the children of Israel and their Exodus journey to the Promised Land really is the story of us. And last week, if you remember, Ken actually got us to the doorstep of the Promised Land. So after 2 years of wandering around and finally getting there, they make it all the way to the doorstep. Like they can go in. Just 2 years later, boom, we're here and we can finally do it. And Ken was able to introduce us to two incredible guys, right? Joshua and Caleb, two faithful leaders who believed in God's promise and provision. But do you remember what happened when they finally got there? Like after all this time and after all this work and after all this effort and all this pain, they get right to the doorstep. They send spies into the Promised Land to scout for 40 days. And what's the conclusion from these spies? Remember, there's 10 guys that go one way, and then there's Joshua and Caleb who go the other. But they go in, they scout for 40 days, and they realize it is everything. The Promised Land is everything that God said that it would be. The fruit's amazing. The ground is fertile. They can't believe how awesome it is. But 10 of the spies come back and say, there's absolutely no way we can take this land. The cities are too fortified. The people are too big and strong. Like, there's no way we can do this. Now, Joshua and Caleb come back and say the opposite. Like, they remember all that God's doing. They know that God is with them. They agree the land is great, but they think God can actually get this done for them. But no one wants to listen to Joshua and Caleb, and it leads to a really devastating result. So let's just read it real quick in Numbers 13. I'll pick it up in verse 25. After exploring the land for 40 days, the men returned to Moses, Aaron, and the whole community of Israel at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran. They reported to the whole community what they had seen and showed them the fruit they had taken from the land. This was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is indeed a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here is the kind of fruit it produces. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants, the descendants of Anak. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites, they live in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley. But Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. He said, let's go at once and take this land. We can certainly conquer it. But the other men who had explored the land disagreed with him. We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report around the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people there we saw were huge. We even saw giants, the descendants of Anak, and next to them We felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too. This is unbelievable, right? They've seen God do incredible things. He's wiped out an army for them 2 years ago. They've walked through seas on dry land. He's dropping food for them. He's with them every step along the way. They finally get to the promised land, and they're afraid, and they don't want to go in. They are overwhelmed with fear and decide once again to go back. That's amazing, right? So the Lord, finally just says, fine, whatever. Okay, you guys go wander in the desert for 40 years, and only Joshua and Caleb are going to actually get to go into this place that I promised you all along. And I love how Ken framed this last week. He was letting us see it, right? That God was leading them, that they knew God was with them because of all that God had done for them before, like guiding them, protecting them, providing for them. But they also now see that to walk into the promised land, they're going to face a battle. And that battle seemed impossible to win. So rather than engage God, they decide not to enter. Fear stole their courage, and they refused to follow God. And what happens? They all end up wandering around in the wilderness for another 40 years, one for every day that they spied out the land until they're all dead, which is yikes, right? Like that's incredible what just happened. Now today, after 5 weeks of studying and talking about all this wandering in the wilderness, we're finally going to go in to the promised land. So we're fast forwarding 40 years, right? And that entire generation of people who didn't want to fight, they died in the wilderness, right? All we have left is Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses has passed away. And I find it so sad to read that Moses never gets to go in to the promised land, right? He gets to go up on a mountain, look into the promised land, but he never steps foot in there. And I've always found that to be such a wow moment, right? So Moses has passed away, and Joshua is now put in leadership, and he's now leading the children of Israel, and he is commissioned by God to take them in to the promised land. Joshua's story is incredible, and today we're going to just touch on a couple parts of it. I want you to really see how God prepared them and then led them into the promised land, and then we're going to look at two battles. We'll call it the tale of two cities, as we see them kind of take on the first two towns that they need to conquer, which are Jericho and a town named Ai. But I want to start by asking you a couple questions, and I'm going to start here. How's your spiritual journey going? How's life going for you right now, right? It's not all that easy, is it? And I've been talking a lot with Ken, and we've been thinking a lot about all the challenges and things that we're looking at, seeing, dealing with, and how hard it is to stay focused on God in any of it. So how are you doing spiritually? I want to ask you this. As life hits, and it continues to hit, and we see a lot of challenges in our world today, I think what ends up happening is, life is just difficult, and it always requires a little more effort than maybe we think that it should, but then we make it worse. I want to explain this to you. I think as people, we make things so much harder than they have to be in our lives because we don't always allow God to lead it. We don't always start with God. Like we jump into all this other stuff. We can get out ahead of what God wants to do in our lives, and we can get out past what God has going, and it makes things that are already hard even harder than they have to be. So in this series, we've talked a lot about things like God's timing and all this different stuff of God leading, right? And there's just stuff about this that is very challenging. First, God's timing is just ridiculously slow to us people, isn't it? Like it's never happening at the speed that we want it to happen at, right? And the second thing is, life just continues to be hard, even with God in it, which is a challenge, right? And while we're talking here, another thing is that nothing seems like, nothing looks like we think that it should, right? Everything is supposed to look a specific way. It's not quite looking that way. And in all of that, the slowness of it, the adversity of it, and things maybe not looking like we want them to look, we can just push to do things our way. And we make things harder than they really need to be. We can make our own plans, and we do our best to live life in our own strength, right? Rather than allowing God to lead, because it doesn't always look right? It doesn't always look like we want it to look like. And I don't know that it's all that intentional on our parts, but I do think that it happens. And if we're not careful, we get out ahead of what God is doing, and it can lead to a lot of pain in our lives. So I believe in this story that we're going to see today, in little pieces of it, we're going to see how Joshua and the children of Israel can get excited, know God's with them, and get out ahead of God, and things can lead to pain in their lives too. And their story is our story. So let's pick this thing up. We're 42 years out. Now, we've been wandering around for 42 years. We're in the time machine. We jump ahead, and we're in the wilderness, back at the doorstep, right? Ken had us there once before. 40 years later, we're back again. We're back at the doorstep of the promised land with God passing the same promise on to Joshua that he had given to Moses, right? Joshua 1, starting in verse 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country to the great sea on the west. No one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. So there it is at the end, right? God saying, I'm with you. I'm about to fulfill every promise that I ever made to you all, and I will never leave you or forsake you. So let's get ready to head into the promised land. Wouldn't this be an exciting moment? Like, it's been 40 years since Joshua and Caleb, who have been in the promised land, right? They know how great it could be and how they wanted to take it all the way back then. They have it all there in front of them, and it's finally time to go in and take this land for God and for themselves, right? And God says something that I wanted to point out. And it's a reminder to Joshua. And so we see that promise being laid on to Joshua from Moses. And then we move into this place where God seems to warn Joshua to obey his laws, but also says you're going to need to be strong and courageous. He actually says it 3 times. And I wanted to point this out to you. He also reminds Joshua who's running the show, but we'll get into that. Joshua 1, starting in verse 6, it says this, be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the laws my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will prosper and be successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. So we see it again. I'll be with you, right? 3 times in that section of Scripture, we see God telling Joshua, be strong and courageous, which should help Joshua and us see something here today. That while they're arriving in the land that God has promised them, and while God is going to be with them in all of it, it doesn't mean that it's not going to be hard, right? It's going to be difficult. You wouldn't need to be strong and courageous if this was going to be easy, right? So we should be picking up on some stuff here. Life was still going to be happening to these people in the promised land. Adversity and battles are still coming, and there's going to be effort and energy and work that is needed as they move into this land that God has promised them. And I want to think about this. If it was easy, you wouldn't need all this encouragement from God to be strong and courageous, right? So it's time to go in. But there's one more thing that God commands of Joshua. And as I was studying this stuck out to me. And I think it's an important thing for us to see, and something important for Joshua to remember as he moved in, and for us as we walk through life. It's really interesting because it's another section of instruction from God here in Joshua 3. Early the next morning, Joshua and all the Israelites left the grove and arrived at the banks of the Jordan River, where they camped before crossing. 3 days later, the Israelite officers went through the camp, giving these instructions to the people. When you see the Levitical priests carry the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, move out from your positions and follow them. Since you have never traveled this way before, they will guide you. Stay about a half mile behind them, keeping a clear distance between you and the ark. Make sure you don't come any closer. That stuck out to me that we're going to put God out in front of us. And then there's going to be this pace that we're going to move at. And you must stay a specific distance away and allow God to do it. You don't run up his back. You don't run past him in any way. You're going to let God lead this journey. And I think it was a really important thing for us to see. And I think we need to put all of this stuff together. But in this part, I think we're seeing we're going to move at God's speed here. Might not always be at the pace we want it to be at. We might get a little excited when we get into this land of milk and honey, but we must move at the speed that God would like us to move at through this journey. He's leading. We're following. So I like that. And it was something I wanted you to see there. But if we put all of this stuff together as we're preparing to head into the promised land, we can see a clear message. I think God is saying clearly, I am with you, right? We see it over and over again, that he will fulfill all the promises that he's made, but it's not going to be easy. You're going to have to stay strong and courageous and obedient to God. They must patiently and humbly follow God as he moves at his pace and not theirs. So we aren't going to push out ahead of him, right? Then God once again reminds them how awesome he is by helping them cross the Jordan River. Like they have one big hurdle left to get into the promised land. The Jordan is at flood stage and there's no bridge, there's no boats, and we see this. Just a cool thing I wanted to share along the way. Joshua 3, starting in verse 14. So the people left their camp to cross the Jordan, and the priests were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and they went ahead of them. It was the harvest season, and the Jordan was overflowing its banks. But as soon as the feet of the priests who were carrying the ark touched the water at the river's edge, the water above that point began backing up a great distance away at a town called Adam, which is near Zarethan. And the water below that point flowed on to the Dead Sea until the riverbed was dry. Then all the people crossed over near the town of Jericho. It's pretty awesome, right? Like, it's a great moment. And I want to ask you something. Can you stay strong and courageous? Do you stay strong and courageous when you're walking through difficult times? Can you allow God to lead your life when you really want something, right? Or do you try to make it happen on your own? See, it isn't easy to stay faithful at times, and it's even harder to stay patient at times, especially when life is so challenging and we can feel like God is moving so slowly in what he's promised to come through for us in. It's hard to stay patient. It's hard to stay at his pace when our goals and our hopes and our dreams are out there in front of us and we want them so bad. But that's what we see here. God reminding Joshua and the children of Israel of the promise, to stay the course, but most importantly, to let God handle stuff the way he's been handling stuff for the last 40-some years. This is an incredible thing. And you're going to see that they kind of struggle to do that, even with all these amazing reminders of God in their lives. So God has passed on his promise. We're going to be strong and courageous. We've parted the Jordan and walked across on dry land, and now we're heading in to the promised land. We're there, right? We finally made it, right? 6 sermons later, here we are. We're in the promised land, and it's time to fight for this land and take it. All those fights that Ken told you about that they ran from 40 years ago, they're right in front of them now. And I'd really like to just spend some time talking to you about 2 very different battles and 2 very different results from those battles that we see in these first 2 cities they hit, Jericho and Ai. So the first big hurdle as they cross the Jordan is the city of Jericho. And Jericho is a military fortress. It's got big high walls and there's just no way in, right? It's surrounded by these walls. It's a stronghold. It's a city that you're not going to penetrate. Joshua would know this, right? He's a military leader, right? And knows that they can't penetrate this fortified city. They very clearly know that they need God to take this city. And what happens next is incredible. In Joshua 6, we see this. Now the gates of Jericho were tightly shut because the people were afraid of the Israelites. No one was allowed to go in or out. But the Lord said to Joshua, I have given you Jericho, its king, and all its strong warriors. You and your fighting men should march around the town once a day for 6 days. 7 priests will walk ahead of with the ark, each carrying a ram's horn. On the 7th day, you are to march around the town 7 times with the priests blowing the horns. When you hear the priests give one long blast on the ram's horn, have all the people shout as loud as they can. then the walls of the town will collapse and the people can charge straight into the town. Okay, can we just say it like, this is not a good military strategy, right? Like, we're going to walk around the city for a week. That's what you're asking us to do. We're going to look silly. It's going to look stupid. The people are going to laugh at us in Jericho. Like, this is not how you win a battle. But remember, God said we're going to do stuff my way. So they do exactly as God commanded. And for 6 days, they march around the city walls. Imagine what this looked like. Think about the perspective from inside Jericho. You'd be sitting there like, well, look at these people. You'd be taking pictures, putting it on social media, trying to do the selfie thing. Like, look at what they're doing out here. It's ridiculous, right? It looks silly and it makes no sense. Like, how does walking around this city do anything? Well, on the seventh day, they do exactly what God asked, and the walls come crashing down, and they take this city that could never be taken. It was very clear that God was doing this, right? They listened to God. They jumped through all the hoops, right? They did the humble and patient thing and obediently did what God asked them to do, and he obviously comes through in an incredible way. He did what he promised because they humbly obeyed and did what he asked. This is an amazing victory for the children of Israel, and it sends shockwaves of fear through the land of Canaan. Like, it's all over Facebook, they're emailing all their friends. Like, obviously God is with these invaders from Israel, right? They are riding some serious momentum after this big victory, which leads us to the second battle at the second town. It's the city of Ai. And a very different story unfolds here. See, the Israelites have just won this big victory at Jericho, and God is clearly fighting for them, but things don't go so well here. Now, first, and it's something they don't know yet, someone named Achan has actually stolen some things from Jericho, kind of kept some of the loot for himself, and that's disobeying God, so there's some sin in the camp. They don't know that part yet, and they'll take care of that later. But like, there's this point here that they're happy and confident, there's momentum. They are assuming if they can take Jericho, they can do anything. And frankly, the Canaanites are thinking that too, like, because no one takes Jericho, right? So the first outcome was an amazing thing, but here we are in their next assault on Ai with a very, very different result. Check this out. So we're in Joshua 7 now. Joshua sent some of his men from Jericho to spy out the town of Ai, east of Bethel, near Bethaven. When they returned, they told Joshua, there's no need for all of us to go up there. It won't take more than 2,000 or 3,000 men to attack Ai. Since there are so few of them, don't make all our people struggle to go up there. So approximately 3,000 warriors were sent, but they were soundly defeated. The men of Ai chased the Israelites from the town gate as far as the quarries, and they killed about 36 who were retreating down the slope. The Israelites were paralyzed with fear at this turn of events. Their courage melted away. Joshua and the elders of Israel tore their clothes in dismay, threw dust on their heads, and bowed face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord until evening. Then Joshua cried out, "O sovereign Lord, why did you bring us across the Jordan River if you're going to let the Amorites kill us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side," right? "Lord, what can I say now that Israel has fled from its enemies? For when the Canaanites and all the other people living in the land hear about this, they will surround us and wipe us out, our name off the face of the earth. And then what will happen to the honor of your great name?" This wasn't supposed to happen, right? I mean, God said he was with them. He promised them all this stuff. Like, they just won this great victory. What's going on? Well, this is a big defeat, total disaster, because not only do they lose, but they also lose all this momentum, and now everybody thinks they can beat these guys, right? So fear has just taken over the Israelites. But we need to see this, and we need to understand why these two different outcomes happened in these two cities. Well, look at what happened here. Joshua sends spies out to do some reconnaissance, see what's going on, and they come back, and what do they say? It's going to be a piece of cake. Like, there's no need to really bother sending the whole army. Let's just send 3,000 of our warriors down, wipe out that town, and onward we'll go. So they're getting a little cocky, right? They think they got this, and they suffer this devastating and humiliating defeat where they're getting chased down out of the city by the men of that town. So what happens? Why does one battle go so well and the other one becomes such a mess? Well, it's pretty clear, and it's something that I want you to see here. At Jericho, it was obvious that they needed God to win that fight. But here at the second battle, it doesn't look as challenging. I mean, they just won a big win. They're flying high, right? And Joshua and the children of Israel, they don't seek God in this, do they? They made their own plan here. They didn't see the need for God to do much anything. This was going to be easier. And I mean, God was obviously with them. He said that he was. So they take matters into their own hands. And they try to do things their way. And they get taught a very painful and humiliating lesson here. So I don't think they meant to be disobedient. But they made a plan in their own strength. They didn't seek God in it. And I think had to assume that God would just do what God has done for them time and time again. But by taking matters into their own hands and rushing it, which, by the way, is understandable. They got to be excited, right? They got out ahead of God, and they paid for it dearly. Now, just to let you know, after this really humbling defeat, they do end up eventually taking care of the sin in their camp. They handle that. They do eventually take the second city, but we continue to see something here. Their story truly is our story. It's interesting, isn't it? They're told by God that he's going to do everything that he promised for them, right? They were told to be strong and courageous and to allow God to lead and to move at his pace, right? And they've continually been reminded time and time again of God's provision and blessing in their lives. But after one great victory, they get all excited and they get out ahead of God. So they knew they needed God at Jericho. I mean, that was a huge challenge in their lives, right? It was obvious that they needed him, but this next town, well, this is going to be easy, so why involve God in such a small thing, right? This is something that I think we need to see because we do this too. First, when you know that God has promised you something and you see that something out ahead of you, it can be really difficult to stay patient and wait for God to move. Remember, he said, move at my pace. You stay behind me. You let me do what I'm doing in your life, and they don't do it here. It's easy to want to try to get those things for ourselves. The second thing is, there's just moments in our lives where it just seems so obvious to involve God in them, isn't there? But there are other moments in our lives where I think it's less obvious. We think we can handle those moments on our own. We don't really need God in those things. So it's easy to trust God in the big, obvious moments, but then not to even worry about or ask him, invite him into the smaller parts and things in our lives. We think we can just handle this stuff. But make no mistake about it. Their story truly is our story. And I think we can take a lot from looking at the difference of these first two battles here in the Promised Land. And I want you to take this as a warning and kind of a thought process and a lesson for your own life. We must be strong and courageous because life is hard and it throws a lot at us. We must allow God to lead our lives, and we have to stay patient and humbly move at the pace that God would like us to move at too. It's not easy, and it will take a focus on and faith at times to stay centered on him, but we must do that. It was interesting as I was writing this out, I kept thinking about one of David's Psalms. It just kind of hit me. I kept coming back to it, and I was thinking about how I wanted to close this out or what I wanted to give you to walk out of here with, and I just kept thinking about Psalm 37. Because, in this story today, we see the Joshua and the children of Israel moving through these first two cities and these first moments in the Promised Land. There's so much to learn. We can stay the course and allow God to lead our lives in all things. And in the big moments where it's very clear that we need him, but also in the everyday, ordinary, smaller moments that maybe we think we can handle it, with all that life throws at us, it's so important to allow God in to all of it and to allow him to lead our lives and to have the strength and the faith to let him lead in all that we do. It's going to take patience, it's going to take humility, and it's going to take a lot of focus because this world is constantly trying to pull our attention away from God. So these were the words I wanted to leave you with today. They're from Psalm 37. This is David talking, and it just felt like great instruction for us today. Psalm 37, starting in verse 3, trust in the Lord and do good. Then you will live safely in the land and prosper. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desire. Commit everything you do to the Lord. Trust him, and he will help you. He will make your innocence radiate like the dawn, and the justice of your cause will shine like the noonday sun. Be still in the presence of the Lord and wait patiently for him to act. Don't worry about evil people who prosper or fret about their wicked schemes. See, there's so much for us to learn from the children of Israel. And I wish they could have been carrying David's words around with them the way that you and I can today. We have that benefit. They really didn't. But I want us to personalize this today. Can you trust the Lord? Do you take delight in the Lord? When you look at your life, do you commit everything you do to God, no matter how big or how small that thing is? Do you carve out time and space to be still and to center your life in the presence of the Lord? Can you wait on God to patiently move for you? Can you be content with your life? Or are you constantly looking over your shoulder at what others have or are doing that seem to be getting them out ahead of you in life? Listen, God loves you and he is with you, but you still will need to be strong and courageous. You will still need to focus on him. You will still need to follow him in humble obedience, which can be tough because things can happen so much slower than we would like them to happen, right? And it's easy to get out ahead of God. But I will tell you, that's a difficult place to be. It's painful, and those are tough lessons to learn. We must be patient. We can't take matters into our own hands. It just doesn't work. So we listen to David here. Trust in the Lord. Take delight in the Lord. Commit every aspect of your life to the Lord. Be still in God's presence and wait on him. And hey, stop looking over your shoulder at what everybody else is getting that you think you're not, and allow God to lead all aspects of your life. I want to thank you guys for listening today, watching today, and I can't wait to get back with you next week as Ken keeps walking us through the Old Testament. We'll see you.